September 19th, 2005, Monday afternoon. Two British soldiers are moving through Basra in an unmarked civilian vehicle, dressed in traditional Arab garments and headdresses, carrying identification that wouldn't survive a close inspection. They are SAS operators, running surveillance as part of Operation Hathor, tracking a corrupt Iraqi police commander whose serious crimes unit had turned a compound in southwestern Basra into something the words police station were never designed to describe. At a checkpoint, Iraqi police stopped the car. What followed is genuinely disputed. British accounts say plainclothes police tried to physically drag the operators from the vehicle. Iraqi accounts say the British opened fire without warning. Both sides agree on the outcome. Shots were exchanged. At least one Iraqi policeman was killed, two others were wounded, and the two British operatives were chased down, beaten, and arrested. By that evening, they were inside the Al-Jamit police station, handcuffed, photographed, their images already broadcast on Iraqi local television. The Iraqi authorities accused them of murder. Their faces were public. Their names weren't. And the facility holding them wasn't, in any functional sense, a police station. It was a Mahdi army stronghold that had learned to wear police insignia. Within hours, a signal came from the UK Permanent Joint Headquarters at Northwood. Restraint. Don't mount a direct armed assault on an Iraqi police facility. The SAS unit on the ground had two colleagues in there. They had a window. And they had a founding philosophy that said, waiting for permission that arrives after the need has passed is itself a form of failure. What they did next saved those men's lives. What came after nearly destroyed the careers of everyone involved in saving them. To understand September 19th, you have to understand what Basra was by the autumn of 2005. British forces had entered the city on the 6th of April 2003, 7 armoured brigade fighting through as Iraqi resistance collapsed. Britain took responsibility for Basra Governorate and the 3 neighbouring southern provinces, bringing a counter-insurgency approach drawn from the Northern Ireland experience. Lighter footprint, berets rather than helmets, engagement over confrontation. For roughly 18 months, relative to Baghdad, the approach held. The markets were open. British patrols moved without full body armour through some neighbourhoods. Senior officers spoke cautiously about demonstrating that occupation could have a different character in the south. Then the Jaish al-Mahdi moved south. Following Muqtada al-Sadr's 2004 uprisings in Najaf and Karbala, Mahdi army fighters relocated to Basra in significant numbers, embedding inside police forces, government institutions, and the neighbourhoods of a city they understood precisely. The Institute for the Study of War's documentation of this period is specific about what that presence looked like in practice. Graffiti warnings spreading across Basra, threatening women without strict Islamic dress. Militia enforcement squads banning Western and Arabic secular music and violently punishing individuals caught selling or playing it. Death squads operating against moderate Shia who had survived the Saddam era only to find a new form of coercive authority replacing the old one. Citizens stayed inside their homes rather than face what the Institute's researchers described as militia death squads and vice enforcers. The New York Times would later describe the Al-Jamit's Serious Crimes Unit as having its headquarters in a police building in southwestern Basra, a militia-controlled facility operating within the formal police structure. The building at the centre of September 19th wasn't a police station that had been compromised. It was in practice a militia facility that had been assigned a police address. By September 2005, academic analysis confirms British forces were locked in a violent battle with elements of the Iraqi security forces in Basra, the same forces the British were nominally there to train and support. The soft approach had produced, in the assessment of one specialist source, effectively no security at all in the city. By 2005, British force numbers in the southern sector had been drawn down significantly from their 2003 peak. The strategic logic being that stability would follow from engagement rather than presence. The militia had a different theory of how power works. Two events in the fortnight before the capture compressed that reality into specific names and dates. On September 5th, Fusilier Donald Anthony Meade, 20 years old, and Fusilier Stephen Robert Manning, 22, both of the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers, were killed when a roadside bomb struck their patrol near Az-Zubair in Basra province. The UK government's fatality register confirms the date, the names, the unit. They were travelling in a snatch Land Rover, the armoured vehicle that British military spokesmen were simultaneously insisting was equipped for the job, while parliamentary reports were criticising its protection levels. 6 days after Meade and Manning died, on September 11th, Major Matthew Bacon of the Intelligence Corps was killed when an IED struck his armoured snatch Land Rover on patrol in Basra city. He was the third British soldier to die in Basra in a single week. September 7th produced something different in scale. A taxi packed with explosives detonated outside a restaurant in a Shia neighbourhood of Basra, killing 16 Iraqis and wounding approximately 24 others. 4 American security contractors working for Triple Canopy were killed in the same attack, confirmed by both the New York Times and the US State Department. 23 dead across a single week. A city that had been deteriorating for a year, reaching a point where the deterioration had a body count that was no longer possible to qualify with diplomatic language. 3 incidents, 6 days, a dozen days before September 19th. What that Monday required was a spark in a room already full of gas. Before this story moves to the checkpoint and everything it's set off, a correction worth making clearly, because it shapes the logic of every decision that follows. The Special Air Service was founded in July 1941 by Lieutenant Colonel David Stirling in Egypt during the North Africa campaign. The Imperial War Museum records the founding purpose plainly: to undertake small-scale raids behind enemy lines. Stirling developed the concept against the opposition of much of the conventional Allied command structure, which regarded independent small unit raiding as a distraction from massed conventional warfare. He argued, from a hospital bed in Cairo after a parachuting injury, that small teams acting independently and without waiting for the authorizations and force concentrations that conventional command required could achieve disproportionate results precisely because they didn't wait. He was right. The regiment has operated on that argument for more than 80 years. The motto, "Who dares wins," isn't a brand asset, and it isn't decorative. Attributed to Stirling's founding period, it's an operating manual. When the mission demands action, and waiting will cost the mission, act. The authorization can follow the result. American viewers familiar with Delta Force, 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, should know the lineage. Delta was formed in 1977 by Colonel Charles Beckwith, a US Army officer who had completed an exchange tour with 22 SAS. Beckwith used that experience as the direct model for Delta's structure, its selection philosophy, and its operating doctrine. His own writing confirms it explicitly. Delta Force is the American descendant of the SAS, not a parallel evolution. That corrects a frequent inversion of the relationship, and it matters here. When the question is which unit invented the principle of acting on mission logic rather than waiting for permission from a command structure that doesn't share the operator's view of the ground, the answer isn't Delta Force in 1977. The answer is North Africa, and it's 1941. On September 19, 2005, a unit built in that tradition was about to apply that principle at a cost nobody had yet calculated. The two operators that Monday afternoon were running covert surveillance, tracking a corrupt Iraqi police commander whose serious crimes unit at the Al-Jami'at was suspected of running extrajudicial violence inside its own compound. Intelligence analysts had been watching the facility for months. The surveillance was ongoing, methodical, the kind of patient targeting work that doesn't look like anything remarkable from the outside. Dressed in traditional Arab clothing, moving in an unmarked civilian car, the two men carried the ordinary appearance of the ordinary streets of a southern Iraqi city in 2005. September in Basra runs into the mid-40s Celsius. The air smells of dust and diesel. Markets compete with traffic noise. A checkpoint is a routine interruption, the kind of thing you drive through a dozen times in a working day. This checkpoint was different. The Iraqi police stopped them. What exactly happened in the next 30 seconds is genuinely contested and will probably never be resolved to both parties' satisfaction. The men in the car knew that their cover identities were thin. They knew that a prolonged inspection, questions their Arabic would eventually fail to answer convincingly, documents that would eventually produce the wrong answers, wasn't a situation that ended well. The Iraqi police, by British accounts, made a physical move to extract the men from the vehicle. A plainclothes officer reached for a door. By Iraqi accounts, the British soldiers fired without provocation. Both accounts agree that weapons came out. Both accounts agree that at least one Iraqi policeman died at the scene. Others were wounded. The car drove. Basra's streets aren't built for a fast escape. The road grid in the southwestern neighbourhoods is tight. Markets spill onto pavement. Traffic creates its own geography of bottlenecks and dead ends. The car was chased. It couldn't outrun what was behind it. The decision was made to stop. The beating that followed wasn't symbolic. Photographs broadcast on Iraqi local television that evening showed the two men visibly damaged. The images ran. The Basra streets around the Al-Jami'at filled with their faces on screens, and their faces told the same story that the Iraqi authorities were already putting into words. These were British spies who had killed an Iraqi policeman. At the Al-Jami'at, the two soldiers were taken inside, handcuffed, held in a compound of prefabricated buildings, a facility simultaneously functioning as a police station, a detention jail, and, in the operational reality documented by multiple intelligence assessments, a militia headquarters that had outgrown its official designation. The Mahdi army had not infiltrated the Basra police so much as it had replaced it, badge by badge, until the uniform meant something different from what the uniform had always been supposed to mean. British intelligence assessed the risk with grim specificity. The Basra police was so thoroughly penetrated that physical custody at the Al-Jami'at was no guarantee of anything. These men could be moved. They could be transferred to private militia hands at any point. And once they were in Mahdi army custody, rather than nominal police custody, the range of outcomes contracted sharply. An execution. A negotiation that lasted weeks and ended the same way. A disappearance into a city that had hundreds of places where two bound men could be kept out of sight indefinitely. The British response mobilised fast. 20 members of A Squadron, 22nd SAS Regiment, were flown from Baghdad to Basra to reinforce the small, on-scene SAS detachment already working the problem. Elements of No. 2 Company, 1st Battalion Coldstream Guards, began moving toward the Al-Jama'it. Warrior armoured infantry fighting vehicles from the Staffordshire Regiment formed a cordon around the compound. 2 officers from 12th Brigade headquarters drove to the station carrying a written ultimatum, a formal demand for the soldiers' release, backed by the authority of the British military command structure in southern Iraq. The Iraqis detained them as well. The letter had 2 new readers rather than the intended one. Then came the moment that changed the character of everything that followed. Aerial surveillance detected movement inside the Al-Jama'it compound. The 2 captives were being moved, bundled into the boot of a car, driven away from the police station, out through the southwestern streets of Basra toward a house not far away, a property under militia control. They were no longer in the facility that all the British planning had been oriented around. They were in transit, then in a house, then behind walls that the ultimatums and the cordon and the diplomatic demands had no address for. Above the city, a Lynx helicopter and an MQ-1 Predator drone maintained continuous surveillance throughout the afternoon and into the evening, feeding live imagery to the UK Joint Operations Centre. The aerial tracking is the element of this operation that receives the least attention in most tellings, and it was the element that made everything else structurally possible. Basra in 2005 is a city of well over 1 million people. The street grid in its residential neighbourhoods is dense, irregular in places, and in the southwestern districts where the Al-Jama'at was located, it's the kind of urban environment where a car making 4 turns becomes genuinely difficult to relocate without eyes that never blink. The militia understood that too. Movements were made quickly, at night, through streets where British ground vehicles would have attracted immediate attention. The Lynx filmed the car from the moment it left the Al-Jama'at's perimeter. The camera followed it through intersections, held it through corners, and maintained observation as it pulled toward the house the militia was using. Every relocation was visible in real time. Every coordinate was relayed to the ground teams preparing to move. What the aerial feed communicated, with a specificity that no ground intelligence could have matched in the time available, was 2 things simultaneously. First, the men were still alive and had not been transferred further into the militia network. Second, every hour that passed was another opportunity for a second move, another transfer, another handoff to someone with less reason to keep the men alive and no known address. The window was open. The aerial coverage was what kept it measurable. The crew above Basra that evening weren't watching a fixed location. They were tracking 2 specific human beings through a hostile city in real time, communicating what they saw to people who would have to act on it, maintaining the thread of observation through every turn and stop. When the car reached the house and the men were taken inside, the coordinates of that house were already in the hands of the people on the ground. The SAS now knew where their men were. The question was whether the political authorization to go and get them was going to arrive before the militia decided to move them again. The stand-down signal, or what multiple later accounts consistently describe as a restraint order from senior UK command, isn't documented in contemporaneous official records. It does not appear in parliamentary transcripts, in Ministry of Defence public statements from that week, or in contemporaneous reporting from the BBC, The Guardian, The New York Times, or Al Jazeera. What it does appear in, consistently, across later accounts from people who describe proximity to the decision, is the claim that an armed assault on an Iraqi police facility wasn't authorised. The political logic wasn't absurd. Storming a sovereign Iraqi police building would be interpreted as British forces acting against Iraqi institutions, And the diplomatic relationship with the Iraqi government, still fragile 2 years after the invasion, was the entire strategic rationale for the southern Iraq mission. Governor al-Waili's public condemnation after the eventual raid, barbaric, savage and irresponsible, a statement confirmed on the record across multiple contemporaneous sources, showed exactly how accurate that political forecast had been. The restraint came from people who understood that this raid would cost something it had taken years to build. And they weren't wrong to consider the cost. The problem wasn't the reasoning. The problem was the vacuum it created. Mark Urban's Task Force Black, one of the most substantive book-length accounts of British special operations in Iraq, is described by reviewers in terms that capture the institutional failure precisely. Indecisiveness at the UK military and political command level meant urgent requests from the ground weren't answered in time, leaving the on-scene unit to make the call locally. The SAS commander on the ground wasn't working against a clear order backed by a coherent alternative plan. He was working against a gap. 2 men in a house, a window closing, and a command structure that had not delivered authorization before the situation had overtaken the possibility of delivering it. He knew what came next if he waited. 2 men moved again. To a new house, a second property, a third. Each relocation cutting the thread of aerial observation. Each transfer carrying a higher risk that the next facility would be the one from which there was no recovery. The mission's objective had not changed: recover those men alive. The mission's method, wait for authorization, had collided with the mission's deadline, and the deadline was winning. Business Insider's account states that the SAS officer in charge received word from the UK and proceeded regardless, with retroactive authorization arriving after the operation succeeded. The framing across multiple later accounts is consistent. The unit read the objective and adjusted the mission to meet it, rather than waiting for political clarity that the operational clock had already made irrelevant. That is precisely the distinction the SAS's founding logic draws. Not insubordination for its own sake, not a display of contempt for authority. An operator's reading of the mission's true purpose when the authority above them had simply stopped being decisive. That is what David Sterling wrote into the unit's operating logic in 1941. That when you wait for the authorization from above, and the authorization doesn't come, and waiting means the mission fails, you do what the mission requires. The plan, when it came, was split into 2 simultaneous strikes. Warrior 1F Vs and Challenger 2 tanks would assault the Al-Jamit compound directly, breaching the walls, storming the police station and jail, freeing the 2 British liaison officers the Iraqis had detained, and generating the kind of noise and armoured force that would fix every armed eye in that part of the city on the compound walls. Simultaneously, the main SAS element would hit the house. Separated operations, calculated so that any militia reaction to the compound assault would draw attention away from the quieter strike happening several streets distant. Around 9 in the evening on September 19th, the British forces moved. Before the main breach, as warriors approached the Al-Jamit, a crowd already gathered around the compound turned hostile. What happened in those minutes just before the tanks went through the wall is one of the few elements of that night captured in photographic and film evidence that is now publicly preserved. The crowd threw stones. Petrol bombs followed, burning cloth and petrol, the kind of improvised incendiary that has appeared in civil unrest from Belfast to Basra because it works against vehicles that weren't designed to stop it. At least one Warrior 1 F5 caught fire, The vehicle's interior temperature, when a petrol bomb gets into the hatches or the engine compartment, rises very fast. Private Carl Hinnett was 19 years old. He was photographed and filmed in the act of jumping from that burning warrior, escaping a vehicle on fire, hitting Basra Street at night, in the middle of a crowd that had just tried to kill him. The image ran in British newspapers the following morning. It sits now in the Imperial War Museum's archive. Evidence of a moment when a teenage British soldier and the city surrounding him were briefly, terribly visible in the same frame. He survived. He suffered burns. The photograph became one of the defining images of Britain's experience in southern Iraq. Not a heroic image, not a triumphant one, but an honest one, recording exactly what the situation cost at street level on a Monday evening when the operational and the political had finished negotiating with each other and the vehicles were moving through Basra. The column pressed on. Challenger 2 tanks and Warrior 1 FVs, the armoured weight of a British conventional force being deployed in a city street, drove into the compound walls of the Al Jamit police station. The walls came apart under that weight, in the way that walls built for a police compound rather than a military fortification come apart, quickly and with a great deal of noise. Governor Al-Wali would claim afterward that the British had used more than 10 tanks backed by helicopters to carry out what he called a barbaric assault. The Guardian's front-page coverage on September 20th reported British forces using tanks to break down the walls of a Basra prison and free 2 undercover British soldiers. That coverage captured the spectacle accurately. What it slightly mislocated was the men themselves. The Al Jamiat was stormed. The conventional forces freed the 2 British liaison officers who had arrived several hours earlier with an ultimatum and had stayed as hostages. Hundreds of Iraqi detainees, some held by an institution that the December 2006 repeat raid would confirm had been systematically torturing prisoners, were swept up in the chaos of the breach. Aqil Jabbar, an Iraqi television cameraman who lived across the street from the jail, told international media that approximately 150 prisoners fled the facility as British armoured vehicles drove through the compound walls. British and Iraqi officials disputed that figure. It comes from one named eyewitness on a chaotic night, in circumstances where a precise count was operationally impossible. It deserves attribution as exactly that. It also deserves naming, because not everyone who walked out of the Al Jamit that night should have been walking freely in Basra, and leaving that cost out is a form of sanitization that serves no honest account of what the operation was and what it produced. While all of that was happening at the compound, the armour, the breach, the crowd, the chaos and the noise, the SAS ground force was moving through a different set of streets toward a different address. The assault on the house met no resistance. The militia who had been holding the 2 men either weren't there in numbers or chose not to fight. What the SAS found when they came through the door was 2 operators, beaten, handcuffed, alive, in a locked room in a militia house in southwestern Basra. The mission's objective was standing in that room. They brought them out. That was the night. The Ministry of Defence initially denied that British forces had stormed the prison at all, claiming the soldiers' release had come as a result of negotiations. CBS News had already reported the armoured assault on video. Al Jazeera had footage. Iraqi officials were giving press statements describing tanks through compound walls, and the British Army's version of events collided immediately with the weight of documentation that was already in the world. The MOD position didn't survive 48 hours against that record. Defense Secretary John Reed addressed the legal framework publicly on September 20th. Under the post-sovereignty transfer arrangements, coalition forces detained by Iraqi authorities were supposed to be handed to the US-led multinational force. Reed confirmed that the Iraqi Interior Minister had ordered the soldiers released and that local Basra authorities had refused. The British had responded to that refusal. He didn't characterize what responding had looked like. The tanks had done that already. The City Council of Basra suspended cooperation with British forces entirely. A local anti-terrorism judge issued arrest warrants for the 2 undercover SAS operators in connection with the Iraqi policeman killed at the checkpoint. Governor al-Wali's condemnation, barbaric, savage and irresponsible, was on the record across multiple outlets by the following morning and stayed there. The Basra governor wasn't wrong to be furious about armoured vehicles through compound walls in his city. He was also the governor of a city whose police anti-terrorism infrastructure had been, as December 2006 would formally document, systematically using those same facilities to torture people. Within the British institutional machinery, the question of accountability for an unauthorised rescue was beginning to take shape. On October 15, 2005, 26 days after the raid, Captain Ken Masters, a senior British military police officer, reported to have been involved in investigating the September 19th incident, was found hanged in his accommodation in Basra. The Ministry of Defence stated that the circumstances weren't regarded as suspicious. The connection between his death and the September 19th inquiry is, in available sources, single-source reporting from the period. It sits in the record as a documented fact. An officer believed to have been investigating the September 19th incident found hanged in his billet less than a month later. The unit's name had leaked to the press during the incident. Task Force Black, the British Special Forces Task Force in Iraq, operating in Baghdad alongside US JSOC, including Delta Force, was renamed Task Force Night. Every institutional layer that could move was moving. The MOD had been forced into a public reversal that generated its own press cycle. Iraqi authorities had issued warrants. The City Council had suspended cooperation. A military police investigator was dead. The unit had been renamed. The rescue that had brought 2 men home was generating institutional shockwaves still moving a month after the night it happened. What came next in terms of formal consequences for the men who made the call is where the available evidence becomes limited and the circulated account becomes persistent. No mainstream press report, no parliamentary record, no book-length source in the available record describes actual court-martial charges being formally initiated against the SAS operators or their commanding officer for proceeding without authorization. The SOFREP narrative describes the commanding officer as believing his career was finished, that a court-martial awaited anyone who had defied the order. Business Insider's account states the SAS leadership knew they had risked court-martial by proceeding. Those are descriptions of anticipated consequences, serious and documented as anticipated, but distinct from proceedings being formally opened. The gap between anticipated punishment and the absence of any punishment requires an explanation. The record doesn't provide one explicitly. What it provides is the outcome. No charges, retroactive sanction, the operation absorbed into the record as a necessary response to an impossible situation. The account that has circulated within special operations communities since 2005, told consistently, told persistently, told by people who understand the institutional dynamics of what that decision had cost and what it had meant, goes like this. There was a push within British military and political circles to discipline the unit for proceeding without authorization. And the response from SAS command was that the entire command structure would resign simultaneously rather than allow it to happen. Not an argument through channels, not a formal appeal, a collective declaration. If you bring charges against these men for doing the job that this regiment was built to do, you bring them against all of us at once. Every senior officer, together. There is no primary document for this in the available record. No named officer on record has confirmed it publicly. No parliamentary question produced it as a formal answer. No letter is archived anywhere accessible. The account exists in the communities that were closest to the decision, passed through 2 decades of telling, and it carries the character of institutional truth, even where the formal paperwork is absent. It's how this kind of thing is often settled inside military institutions, not through official correspondence, but through the understood weight of what the response to a formal process would cost the institution that initiated it. What is confirmed is the outcome. No charges were brought. The rescue was retroactively sanctioned by British political and military leadership. The commanding officer who made the call wasn't publicly disciplined. The unit went back to work. The gap between the documented anger and the documented absence of consequences is real, and it requires the something that filled it. The account that fills it, a wall reportedly formed before the machinery could close, is unverified in its specific mechanism, and entirely consistent in its operational logic. That outcome, no charges, the men recovered, the unit back at work, is what the record supports with certainty. On Christmas Day 2006, 15 months after the night the challengers went through the Al-Jamit walls, British troops from 1st Battalion, the Staffordshire Regiment, raided that same facility again. Operation Sinbad. They killed 7 gunmen. They freed 127 prisoners showing signs of torture. Then they demolished the building. The Basra City Council called that raid illegal too. What Operation Sinbad confirmed, officially, formally, with 127 released prisoners as the evidence, was what the September 19th operation had already established through the harder method of getting 2 men out. The Al-Jamit wasn't a police station that had drifted into bad practice. It was a systematic torture facility operating behind a police address, and it had been that facility throughout the period when British forces were being counselled not to assault Iraqi sovereign institutions. The political anguish about British forces attacking Iraqi police buildings had been, on both occasions, anguish about attacking walls, behind which systematic abuse was the operational purpose. The restraint counselled in September 2005 was cautious in the right direction. Diplomatic consequences were real, and they materialized exactly as predicted, and wrong in its assessment of what was actually being protected by that caution. The Basra rescue works as a story, has worked as a story for 20 years, because of the collision it makes permanently visible. A unit built in 1941 on the principle that you do what the mission requires when the mission requires it, without waiting for authorizations that will arrive after the need is over. A political system simultaneously responsible for 2 men in a militia house on a Monday evening, and for a diplomatic relationship that storming that house would damage.
A decision made in the gap between what command had authorized and what the situation demanded. Made in real time, under aerial surveillance, with 2 hours at most before the next relocation. That turned out to be right by every measure that didn't exclude the 2 men who came home alive. The assault on the compound is the easy part to tell. Tanks through walls, a burning warrior in a Basra street, a 19-year-old soldier jumping from a vehicle on fire, 2 men found in a locked room in a militia house, beaten and alive. That is the night that gets written up and retold, because it has the structure of a story that resolves cleanly. What is harder to hold, and what most tellings leave on the floor, is what came in the weeks afterward. The institutional machinery turning toward the people who had done it. The arrest warrants from an Iraqi judge. The city council suspending cooperation. The MOD reversing its public position under press pressure. A military police investigator found hanged in his billet. A unit renamed. And the account that circulates in communities that understand the job. That a wall formed around the men who made the call. That it held. And that what stopped the machinery was the threatened cost of moving it forward. Not the firefight. Not the photograph of Carl Hinnett. Not the challenges through the compound walls. The moment the institution blinked. And who forced it to? That wall, documented in its outcome, if not in every detail of its mechanism, is why this one is still told. Subscribe for more stories like this.